Okay, Catherine, how much time do we have?
For at least 20 minutes.
20 minutes? If your dean doesn't show up, okay. Lock the doors. No, sorry. Sure. No, it's been a long day. Okay. So thanks very much to our presenters. We've got two papers on mobile or migrant agricultural workers and their occupational health and safety issues, and then Wayne's paper on the Toronto McMaster precarious worker issues using his precarity index. So I'm going to just start the discussion just briefly, and it looks like we have some questions, so that's very good. That my job is to just get us started. Wayne, I guess one of my questions is, if the household is so important from a health and safety point of view, in terms of the health of the precariously employed workers, what do we know about the households of the workers that you have surveyed? And are there particular kinds of households where the challenges are more of precarious employment are greater than others?
Certainly the majority of people who we survey, because we're surveying people 25 to 65, are in households. So they're not, for the most part, they're not living alone. But what we do know is that within those households, there has often been a delay in forming a household. So people have this reluctance to get into relationships when they have this uncertainty of where their next paycheck's coming from. But I think the more significant characteristics of these households are that they tend to delay having children, starting a family. Because again, I think the argument is, the expenses that children place on you are not periodic and precarious, they're constant. And then if your income is periodic, but the expenses are constant, then that creates all kinds of stresses. So we see those kinds of tensions within the households, but in many ways, these are the same kind of people who had households and families in the 70s. Just the employment relationship has fundamentally changed.
Okay, thanks. And I think, for the two studies on agricultural workers, I'm thinking particularly of Fred's, where one of the really challenging things, I think, from a research perspective, is to actually gain access to migrant workers, temporary foreign workers, precisely because of the vulnerability. And I think in your research, Fred, one of the things that you've done is actually go to the country where they came from. Or it was a little unclear to me from your paper whether you were interviewing the workers in France, or whether you went to Morocco to talk to them after they had returned. And often I think there needs to be more of that going to where they end up to really capture the full extent of externalization.
Merci Barbe. Oui, en fait, j'ai eu le temps de faire les deux, puisque j'ai mis 7 ans à faire ma thèse, donc j'ai eu tout le temps disponible pour ça. J'ai d'abord fait du terrain dans le sud de la France, et j'ai bénéficié de l'entremise de tous les syndicats et de toutes les associations avec lesquelles, dans lesquelles je suis rentré. Ça a été vraiment une recherche par ce biais-là, et c'était aussi ça qui était riche, c'est-à-dire qu'on avait des gens qui se livraient aussi parce que vous pouviez leur apporter quelque chose d'une certaine façon. Et cette question de la réciprocité et de l'échange dans la relation de recherche, je crois que c'est une question vraiment importante que les standards de recherche interdisent généralement de penser et de poser comme tel. J'ai aussi fait du terrain au Maroc, et là c'était important parce que j'ai eu accès justement à toutes les personnes qui n'étaient plus dans le dispositif, donc soit parce que le contrat n'avait pas été renouvelé pour des raisons économiques, soit parce que c'était des gens qui avaient protesté. Et évidemment, pour les questions de santé au travail, c'était d'autant plus intéressant que c'était tous les gens qui avaient été cassés, tous les gens qui avaient été exposés, qui avaient déclenché des pathologies là-bas. Donc il y a un grand sociologue que je pense qui est connu ici aussi, algérien en France, Abdelmalek Sayad, qui parlait de l'intérêt de travailler à la fois pour quelqu'un qui travaille sur les questions migratoires, qui travaille à la fois la perspective émigration-immigration. Voilà, je crois que là, on a un exemple contondant de l'importance de cette démarche.
Questions again?
Hello. Hi, Terry Aversa from OPSU. Just a short question for Wayne, and then one for the other two studies. Oh, I have to take this off. I'm listening to myself twice. So your work is very interesting, Wayne. It brings to mind who is using what definition of precarity, so who defines it? How many different ways is it defined, and what is their agenda in defining it that way? So I wondered if you've looked at like how different. Is anyone defining it in your terms of the characteristics, or if they don't want to show a difference some other way by employment relationship. Just wondering that. And then for the other two, the two studies, how important is status in a country as opposed to having just a temporary status, or mobility to control working for different employers if they want, and unionization, because here in Canada we have two agricultural migrant worker programs that kind of compete against each other, where the federal rules that you can repatriate for basically no reason nullifies provincial rights for health and safety and access to compensation, and the advocacy groups are focused on a number of things, unionization for one, where in some parts of the country there's a right to unionize, in others there isn't. They're focused on status, getting a more secure status, which then opens up doors to get other rights practically, and the right to change jobs and more mobility. So that was the question on the other two studies.
Vinay Sharma from Unifor. I got a two-part question. First part is, how well have the trade unions worked with community-based labor groups, such as in Canada we have the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, Latin American Trade Union Council, or the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. And the second part is, the migrant workers, foreign workers themselves, are they organized within, since they are from different communities? We have in Canada, for example, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, Justicia for migrant workers, and Migrante. So how well are those working in those studies that you have done? Thanks.
I just got one short observation on Frederick's paper and then a question. On Frederick's paper, I love the idea of these people having to sign a contract and get a clearance from their last employer. That was, again, a return to the past because it was called a discharge certificate, and it was widespread in the merchant marine and also amongst land-based servants in the mid-19th century under the Master and Servant Act. So we're going back to reinvent the old employment relationships, which really truly subordinated workers. The question I'd like to ask, and it's a link between Wayne's paper and the other two, is that when Wayne made the point that Barb helped raise about the families not having children, now this has been noted with precarious work in a number of countries, and what you can see then is a declining birth rate, and that then you need to bring in more workers to fill the gaps in the longer term, and there's no long-term discussion about, because the system now is you can get your labour from anywhere. So there's that aspect to it, that you're bringing in a dispensable workforce because you've got created work situations that don't help to create a workforce in the long term. And then against what Frederick's paper really highlighted as well is you don't really give a stuff about the people you're bringing in or their family relationships because there's an endless supply. So I'd just like to get your... So I think that actually there's some link-ups here, and it really goes back to the whole point of how precarious work relates within family structures and households.
Okay, first to Terry's point, and I'm actually, I'll give a shout out for Terry. She's done a brilliant study on agricultural workers in Ontario, and pointing out what can only be one of the most bizarre bureaucratic contradictions you can imagine, that in Ontario, as an agricultural worker, you're not allowed to take a job other than the one you were offered when you came as an agricultural worker, and then you get injured and you can't do that job, and so then you want to get compensation from the compensation board, but the compensation board says, well, you can do another job, and therefore we can't give you any compensation. And of course, you can't do that other job because the left hand said you can't have another job, and the right hand says you can get compensation if you take another job, and of course you end up in a squeeze play. So she's written a really good thesis on that, and I'd recommend having a look at it. I think the question of who's defining precarity, I mean, that is the whole issue, I think. And there's a current of debate out there that is trying to argue that the labor market really hasn't changed. It's just like the 1970s. There's not a health and safety problem, and Philip Cross from Alberta has been making that case using Stats Canada data. The Toronto Dominion Bank, their economist, is using that data and making that case. And for whatever reason, the CIBC, that bank, is using other data saying things are different. I'm not exactly sure which part of the market the CIBC is trying to corner versus the TD Bank, but one bank is saying things are getting bad and one bank is saying things are okay. So I think it's an interesting question. I think the point is that what we have to do is we have to think through what is it that makes a job precarious? And it's not a label that says I'm a contract worker. It's something that says I don't know where my money's coming from. I don't know if I have any protections. I don't know my hours. I don't know my schedule. And that's what makes you precarious, not if, in quotes, your job is contract. So I think what we have to apply is some logical rules. I think, Michael's point, I think that is an important, and it points out a contradiction in some ways of where the labor market is going. We're not reproducing workers in the richer countries because of the form of the employment. And absolutely right, we just import them from other places. And again, my colleague Don Wells is doing some work on this, and I've been trying to convince him that the title of his next paper should be "We Get Cheap Tomatoes, They Get Dysfunctional Families," because I think that's exactly what's happening. We're exporting the problems. We bring these agricultural workers here for 10 or 11 months. It's often the male, but not always, and so they're away from home. And quite clearly, that allows the migrant family to have a material standard of living that they couldn't imagine. But it still is a dysfunctional family because the family unit has broken up. The children develop all kinds of problems, and I think that is a major contradiction that we're building into the system, amongst many others.
Fred, you had questions?
Ouais, ça fait beaucoup de questions. Je ne suis pas sûr de pouvoir répondre à tout. Sur la question de la précarité qui ne m'était pas directement adressée, je pense que déjà si on réfléchit en termes de la dimension d'instabilité et la dimension d'insécurité, on a déjà un peu d'éléments pour réfléchir. C'est pas la même chose, quoi. De pas être sûr d'avoir du boulot demain, c'est pas la même chose que d'avoir des contrats courts. On a l'exemple des permathems dont je parlais tout à l'heure. On a différentes manières de créer de l'insécurité, de la précarité. Il faut réfléchir à comment dans chaque situation concrète on crée cette précarité. C'est vrai que c'est un peu la notion tarte à la crème, et il faut rentrer finement dans les relations d'emploi pour essayer de comprendre ce qui se joue et ce qui met les droits en échec. Sur la question des accommodements qu'on peut trouver dans le statut, moi c'est ce que j'essaie de démontrer un peu, c'est justement que tout passe par le statut et que c'est une relation de travail dépendant, de travail bridé, de travail non libre qui est créée par la loi, qui est créée par des relations, des conventions bilatérales de travail entre deux États, qui sont des modèles qui sont diffusés au niveau des organisations internationales type OMC, type OIT, type Banque mondiale, type OIM. On a une véritable offensive avec des académiciens, des chercheurs qui se prêtent au jeu et qui produisent de la connaissance fonctionnelle pour cette pensée-là, d'utilitarisme migratoire. Il faut absolument dénoncer ça et montrer les collusions qu'il existe entre ce milieu de la recherche aux ordres de l'utilitarisme migratoire et la technostructure qui met en place ce type de modèle. Donc le statut, il est important et justement, je crois qu'au Canada, vous avez par exemple des organisations comme Justice qui par exemple propose, à défaut de proposer la liberté de circulation, qui selon moi serait la meilleure des solutions et qui permettrait de rétablir une relation d'équité entre travailleurs nationaux et travailleurs migrants, c'est-à-dire la possibilité pour chaque travailleur de allouer sa force de travail où bon lui semble, dans les conditions que bon lui semble, et de lui donner les éléments pour faire valoir ses droits. On a la proposition qui est faite par Justice de au moins permettre à ces travailleurs d'avoir des permis de travail ouverts, c'est-à-dire que les travailleurs aient la possibilité de changer de secteur, de changer de secteur géographique, de changer de secteur d'emploi. Donc, par exemple, un peu comme sur le système du programme comment ça s'appelle, Live in Caregivers, qui est après 4 ans, on a des possibilités d'établissement sur des statuts permanents. Je pense que c'est la responsabilité des organisations syndicales et du mouvement social de poser ces exigences en termes de droits des étrangers. Est-ce qu'il existe des organisations communautaires en France? Vous savez qu'on a un modèle, le modèle universaliste républicain dont les affres sont ce qu'on connaît aujourd'hui, rend très difficile l'organisation des travailleurs en termes communautaires, alors que par exemple dans la zone de l'Andalousie en Espagne, on a un syndicalisme, le SOC, Sindicato Obrero del Campo, qui s'organise sur la base des organisations communautaires qui existent et ça fonctionne beaucoup mieux. Il y a une vraie difficulté de travailler comme organisation syndicale avec les travailleurs migrants et le passage par des organisations communautaires est une stratégie, à mon avis, à valoriser. Sur la question de Michael, sur les réminiscences avec certaines figures du passé de contrôle du travail ouvrier, en France, c'est très clair, c'est le livret ouvrier qui disparaît à peu près dans la deuxième moitié du 19e siècle. Et c'est assez intéressant de voir qu'à partir du moment où le livret ouvrier disparaît pour les travailleurs nationaux, on a la mise en place, on a la montée des premières lois d'immigration. Et donc on va avoir une substitution, à partir du moment où on a dans certains secteurs une substitution de la main-d'œuvre, on a la tombée en désuétude du livret qui contrôle la mobilité des travailleurs nationaux et un certain nombre de c'est mieux comme ça. Et un certain nombre de dispositifs qui vont permettre de restreindre l'allocation, la libre allocation de la force de travail migrante sur le marché du travail. Sur la question, je veux pas être trop long, sur la question des liens avec l'économie familiale, moi j'ai beaucoup utilisé un modèle qui a été créé d'économie politique marxiste, qui a été créé dans les années 70 par Claude Meillassoux, qui parlait en fait de migration circulaire et qui montrait que à partir du moment où on avait des travailleurs qui venaient de pays dans lesquels subsistaient des modes de production domestique. Après, on peut discuter sur ce que c'est qu'un mode de production domestique et parler des préjugés qui sont derrière une telle conceptualisation. Mais à partir du moment où on a une capacité à restreindre la liberté de mobilité des travailleurs entre ces deux zones, entre le mode de production domestique et le mode de production capitaliste dans les pays d'arrivée, on a une possibilité d'extraire non seulement la plus-value de la force de travail de leur travail salarié, mais on a aussi la possibilité d'extraire la rente en travail de l'économie domestique. Et là, on a une profitabilité beaucoup plus importante du travail migrant. Sur la question, je vais juste finir sur cette question-là, sur c'était la question en fait de la place des familles en fait dans les projets migratoires et dans l'organisation de la mobilité. Moi j'ai vu une différence très importante, même si j'en suis qu'encore à la phase exploratoire pour le cas de l'immigration guatémaltèque au sud du Mexique, entre ce programme un peu déjà rodé, qui a été créé en 46 pour les travailleurs marocains. Donc on a eu une sorte d'évolution en fait dans les bassins de production des économies familiales, de gens qui se sont petit à petit par exemple détournés de la terre et qui ont été beaucoup plus dépendants de leur incorporation temporaire dans l'économie capitaliste dans les pays du Nord. Et alors que dans les pays, alors qu'au Mexique, on a des travailleurs guatémaltèques qui sont pour la plupart des minifundis de la région de Los Altos, la région Mame, et on a des gens qui se déplacent en famille, qui viennent travailler en famille, ce qui pose, ce qui prend des avantages importants pour l'industrie caféière dans la mesure où le travail est rémunéré à la pièce. On a donc des familles qui vont cumuler la force de travail et qui vont permettre une augmentation des rendements avec la nourriture qui la plupart du temps est donnée simplement aux travailleurs déclarés, ce qui oblige les travailleurs à partager la nourriture. Juste pour donner un ordre d'idée de ce qu'est la nourriture offerte par les fincas cafetaleras dans le sud du Chiapas, c'est 80 grammes de haricots cuits et 1 kilo de tortilla pour une journée. Donc on voit que quand on a encore une subsistance de l'économie, des économies familiales, on a une plus grande profitabilité et on a des systèmes qui se pensent différemment et qu'il faut, si on est dans une logique syndicale, penser différemment. On en parlait hier, par exemple, on a du mal à comprendre en fait, depuis la logique syndicale, qui est une logique principalement de contrat, de comprendre que les travailleurs, la plupart du temps, ne mobilisent pas le droit du travail. On a des gens qui sont dans des logiques de sauvegarde de l'emploi, qui sont dans des logiques de maximisation de l'emploi, d'accumulation du temps de travail, de mutualisation par l'économie familiale, et c'est ça qu'il faut essayer de comprendre si on essaye ou si on prétend défendre le droit de ces travailleurs. Merci.
Annabelle, is there anything you want to add? I mean, I know in your thesis you talk about the callousness of the employers, and I think we've heard from Frederick's example, a very vibrant example of a callous employment relationship where somebody, I mean, it's quite striking to me that these workers are temporary, and the idea is that you bring them in to meet demand, but and it's not uncommon for the same workers to be brought back to the same employer year after year after year. And then what we heard was a description of a worker where this happened, and then the worker is basically cast off when they're too ill to continue working. And I think in your thesis you talked about some of the things that the employers had to say about the workers, and you talked about it as a callous kind of perspective. And I just wondered if you would touch on that, because I think it's an important piece of this.
Which aspect is that?
If you're not
No, it's fine. Okay, yeah, so the employers, I mean, their opinions of the workers were actually fairly low. Incidental to my actual field research, I actually did some seasonal work with some fruit pickers to get a feel for what it was like. Obviously, I didn't mention this in the thesis. And at the time, there was some dispute there because the workers weren't being paid, and actually I wasn't paid either. So before I left, I said to them, go and put them in touch with who they could speak with. And then I was interested to see in an interview in a newspaper, one of the employers, spoke of the workers so poorly and said that, they're just here to earn money and then they leave and they, because they're rushing back to the cities for New Year's Eve, for the fireworks, and this suggestion that they're not being paid isn't true. Now these workers were employed by a labour provider, and this was the grower saying this. And it was interesting to me because I was there and I worked with them on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, and they were still there on New Year's Eve. So, the perception was wrong, and I was curious as well as to what the grower wasn't the one not paying them. So what was in it for the grower to be casting them that way? Sort of, and then of course the load provider was from New Guinea, I think, and they ended up fleeing the country. So it's still unresolved, I might add. But there was that feeling, and the workers as well, like, their attitude was the farmer doesn't care about me. And these are people that they didn't always speak wonderful English, but I think that if people feel that they're being mistreated, they can articulate that. And so they said, he doesn't care about me, and this is why, we work without protection, and we work without this, and we work without that, He, was a Frenchman, and he said, look, he says to himself, I see this work for 2 weeks, and then after I don't see this man. And so that was clear with all the workers, and as well, the employers often spoke about legislation and it's gone too far and we're trying to wrap the workers up in cotton wool. But what I found with the workers was that there was a lot of individualisation of risk. You know, they said, when I would say who's responsible for your safety, they said, well, I didn't think anyone was. And others would say, well, the way I see it is if I fall out of the tree, I fell out of the tree. The farmer didn't push me out of the tree, so it's not his fault. So, you know, the way both sides are viewing each other was really starkly different. But certainly, and you had other examples with the 88-day thing. It needs to get signed off on, and workers reported that they did the days, and then they would try and follow up to get the contractor to sign off on those days, and they just didn't return the call, or they'd say, yeah, I'll do it, and they never did it, and they're just hanging around in these country towns, and so they've done the work, they don't get the 88 days recognition. So I've forgotten what your question was now, but surely I've touched upon it somewhere. Sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so thanks everyone. It's been a long, wonderful day. Thanks to the panelists. And enjoy your cocktail.